What you guys are seeing on your screen right here is pretty unique footage. I know this game primarily by its internal codename of Leo. You guys know it more formally as Fast and Furious Crossroads. This game was released in August of 2020, but was pulled from store shelves, yes, including Steam, by April of 2022. You can no longer purchase this game. A lot of people don't know this, but this game was a solid year and a half of my life. I was one of a handful of internal testers for the project, and yes, I am credited in the game's opening credits. You can see my name. I believe this footage was captured in the spring of 2018, almost 2 years before the game's official launch. And of all the videos I still had saved on my YouTube channel, this was probably the most captivating footage. Here I'm benchmarking all the different cars currently available in the game as of early 2018 to try and get some sort of baseline performance metrics for them. So this is me hustling all of the cars in Crossroads, unlike they've ever been hustled in this game before. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because the game was designed to have a 3 versus 3 versus 3 online element that closely resembled Overwatch. The idea is that everyone on your team would select a different car and play a different role, and it would be kind of like cops versus robbers in Midtown Madness, but taken to the extreme with a ton of different tactics and stuff. Further reinforcing the idea of hero-based gameplay, each car would have a weapon unique to that car attached to it. We'd also have an unlocking mechanic in multiplayer, so as you earned XP and leveled up, you'd unlock new cars, so we'd need a way to tune that as well. So to get any sort of balancing done for this mode, I had to hotlap all the cars so we could build a giant spreadsheet of all the cars' different performance metrics, and then figure out how to balance them. This was made extremely time-consuming because despite using the Madness engine for this game, we had cut out all the different timing and scoring loops that you'd commonly see in a racing simulator. So I would have to manually record my runs on Shadowplay using a circuit I had crafted in the game's Barcelona map, and then watch the timer and the debug metrics on the screen to get the ET of my run and then put that onto a spreadsheet. This was not glamorous work, to say the least. And this was not the only time I had to do this. Any major handling revision that came throughout the game's development, which there were a few, I would have to do this all over again. And as you can imagine, as we added more and more cars to the game, those would have to get benchmarked too. I'm not complaining, I'm just telling you guys that that's what testing this stuff entails. The very unfortunate part is that a lot of this work went to nothing. The idea of building Overwatch on wheels with the Fast and Furious license sounded a lot better on the initial pitch decks than it did when we actually tried to play it. From day one of playtesting, our multiplayer component felt like flying fighter jets in a gymnasium, and you can see this pretty clearly in the retail game. The few videos that exist of this game's online multiplayer component, it's almost impossible to tell what's going on. But of course, we'd already committed to that unique brand of 3v3v3 online multiplayer, so there was really nothing we could do. That's what Universal signed off on and expected us to build at that point. All the work I did benchmarking these vehicles for what I hoped to be at least a somewhat competent online mode basically was wasted. Online was way too chaotic to even figure out what was going on, and of course, as things would pan out, nobody even played it. As you can imagine, being a lifelong sim racer and getting recruited by one of the biggest sim racing developers in the industry, only to spend the majority of my day breaking the power slide mechanic as you see here in what's essentially a children's game, was an extremely squandered opportunity. That's time I'm just never going to get back, really. Now, don't get me wrong, some mission-based driving games, which Fast and Furious Crossroads ended up being, can actually turn out okay. Throughout development, I did try and keep at least a somewhat positive outlook, saying that, yeah, mission-based driving games under the right context can actually do quite well, both critically and financially. People forget that before Grand Theft Auto became Grand Theft Auto, the Driver franchise on the PC and original PlayStation was pretty well respected. It turns out that historically, not everyone wants to drive GT3 cars at Spa all the time, and if you give people an open world and some 70s muscle cars to bomb around in, that actually sells pretty okay. This game sold 1 million copies in an era where video games didn't just go out and sell 1 million copies. Like, that wasn't something that happened regularly. Oh, and then the sequel sold 2 million copies because, of course it did. People like this shit. Driver also wasn't the only game of this type to get that kind of reception. A few years later, we'd be blessed with something called Simpsons Hit and Run. This was, for all intents and purposes, Grand Theft Auto for kids whose parents were afraid of them playing violent video games, and it ended up being one of the best licensed tie-in games ever. It turns out that driving around as Homer Simpson and solving mysteries and hitting jumps once in a while is actually kind of cool. So, where did these games succeed and where did Crossroads fail? Well, it's down to two factors. First, you've probably noticed this from the gameplay already. The cars in Hit and Run and the cars in Driver actually have a nice sense of weight and inertia to them, and it feels rewarding to drive them. You spend so much of your time in these games going from point A to point B, and every bit of it is satisfying. When you look at the cars in Crossroads, because even back in 2018, the handling model really did not change drastically compared to what we had on the drawing board at first versus what we shipped the game with. The cars have a ton of side force, they're super stiff, they're glued to the ground, it's basically impossible to spin them out. Everything that makes driving cars fun at just a fundamental level, we removed from the game. There was unfortunately concern from several sides that making the cars have realistic weight or handling nuances to them would turn off the younger audience, but we essentially went way too far in the other direction. In hindsight, it was just not a great call. 6-year-old kids are able to figure out Minecraft, and an entire generation of kids figured out how to play Simpsons Hit and Run, and no one really took inventory of that. God forbid someone has to use the brake or gets crossed up when chasing down a bad guy and maybe crashes their car and has to restart the mission. That was seen as just the worst thing in the world by several parties. The game always had to make players feel good about themselves all the time, but it came at the expense of the actual game being, like, fun. Driving a car is fun at a fundamental level because you always know your one wrong input from kind of fucking yourself up, and it's rewarding to not fuck up. Even as a kid, and I wasn't a kid all that long ago when you really think about it, I remember enjoying getting better at video games. We decided that that was inappropriate. I very obviously just do not agree with that decision. And it's one of two major decisions that ended up crippling this game. The second decision is something we can now talk about openly in 2023, and most of us are going to be on the same page. Most of this game was indeed designed to push an agenda and seek brownie points from specific publications. I personally believe that the higher-ups at the time were simply out of touch. It has nothing to do with something like an ESG score. They probably noticed how every single article on mainstream gaming sites like Kotaku were taking a social justice slant, and just how frequently they were running across pride or trans flags in people's bios on Twitter. I believe they did not recognize that Twitter is not an accurate representation of real life, and gaming journalism has become slowly populated with more and more left-leaning types, and instead believe that the perpetually online activist types that occupy Twitter were an accurate representation of the general population. From that point forward, things snowballed into deciding that Fast and the Furious, which had traditionally been a light-hearted car film, needed to be a deep commentary on gender identity and sexual identity. The game constantly rubs social activism causes that were popular in the early 2020s directly in your face. I personally saw the internal discussions and how these little components were celebrated, which felt unsettling to read. We were not designing the narrative elements to be fun or engrossing, we were designing it to fit an agenda. Despite the Fast franchise already having a pretty diverse cast, we went out of our way to invent a non-binary protagonist who proudly wore a sweatshirt with the slogan, "Create your own identity," on it. We knew full well that Fast and Furious fans would not like this. We did it anyway, because we wanted clout from gaming journalists who were becoming increasingly more political and increasingly more left-wing. These people make up such a small and insignificant part of the population that there was zero purpose of doing this beyond pushing an agenda. When talking about it internally, we celebrated the fact that we'd have the first non-binary leading character in a video game, and hoped that it'd get our company's name out there to a wider audience and that we'd be at the forefront of social change. I personally saw those discussions. It was not right, and it was disrespectful to fans of the franchise. It also didn't pan out quite as we'd expected. The attention we hoped to attain from these social justice types never actually came. In reality, just a single article was written about us, and there were maybe 10 comments total on the Reset Era thread. The author was someone who writes nothing but social think pieces like this disguised as gaming journalism. And of the 10 or 12 comments total on the article, some of these users said thanks, but admitted they wouldn't be buying the game anyways. We drastically altered the trajectory of a major creative project with millions in backing behind it to appeal to maybe 10 people on Reset Era. Years spent in development, all of those actors we paid for, all the vehicle licenses, we obviously had to call Dodge and McLaren, all the brands you see in the game. We also had to do retakes, which is pretty normal for some of the actors. Then the marketing campaigns, then the constant checks with Universal Studios to make sure they were okay with what we were making. The deadlines we hit, the deadlines we missed for this. For a 10-person comment chain on Reset Era to say thanks but no thanks. And we didn't actually stop there. Attached are some screenshots I took in late 2019, the game is about 8 months from launch at this point, of the New Orleans street racing mission that takes place during the game's third act. We knew full well that this was not what Fast and Furious fans wanted from a game like this, but we did it anyway because we were desperately seeking approval from social justice types. We were taking a beloved film franchise and trying to turn it into a political statement that we'd then go out and market to kids. It was not appropriate. It made me feel pretty uncomfortable and was very obviously just performative pandering. This extends to more than just sexual identity and gender identity topics. This same mission, so while we're already talking about certain flags being displayed, you're tasked with driving an electric car and beating up on all the gas guzzlers. It's a little too on the nose. There's, of course, the classic girl power scenes where the three protagonists stand in a row and try and look badass like this is Charlie's Angels or something, but unlike Charlie's Angels, there ain't no Drew Barrymore here. Charlie's Angels worked because it was sexy and it was funny and it was all done in jest. This game was made to be a political and social justice statement, and so people would write nice articles about us so they might promote our company a little more. What do you think I'm building to here? While we indeed receive the desired attention from certain left-leaning outlets and individuals, we also learned the hard way that there are so few of them, this didn't actually translate into sales or any sort of notoriety or positive reception for the company. VG Insights pegs Fast and Furious Crossroads at just 4,500 copies sold. To the best of my knowledge, this is an accurate figure. The original Project Cars, from the same core staff, making a cool race car game for people who just wanted to drive cool race cars after work, sold 2 million. I'm not saying the line, but it applies here.